Hello and welcome to our second part of our module series on developing a continuum of response to concerning behavior. This is part 2, and we are focusing on developing a discipline flowchart for schools. My name is Karen Robbie, and I'm here with Heidi Cloutier.
And we're trainers with the Northeast PBIS Interventions and Supports Massachusetts PBIS Academy.
So our purpose for today is to focus on how we develop a flowchart to communicate procedures to staff and develop consistency. You can find the information linked to this content in section 2B7 of your Getting Started workbook.
Great. So just a quick reminder of why a continuum of consequences or responses to responding to concerning behavior is necessary. We want to ensure that we're using consistent consequences that match the level of concerning behavior that we're seeing in students. And obviously we want the least severe consequences to match the behaviors that are deemed the least severe. And the most severe consequences should be reserved for the most severe rule violations. We discussed this in greater detail in part 1 of the 3-part series, which you can access on the Northeast PBIS website.
Thanks, Heidi. So there are 3 basic important components of organizing your building and district responses to concerning behaviors. One is making sure that you have clearly defined behavioral definitions, which was discussed in part 1. The other is to develop a flowchart so that all staff not only know the difference between staff versus office managed behaviors, but also how to respond and what the protocols are. And the third is to create a consistent behavior or discipline referral form to help track behavior data. Today's focus, like I said, is on creating a flowchart so that students experience consistent responses from staff.
So this flowchart helps us to prevent uncertainty with staff about what to do in the heat of the moment. But it's also important to recognize that we all have different thresholds and moments in time when we might be more susceptible to make snap decisions, depending on what's going on in our own lives. So if we're not feeling well one day, or we are caring for sick parents, or might be going through a divorce or something like that, then it can increase our vulnerability to not adhere to these guidelines, right? And so your school might want to also look into teaching staff about vulnerable decision points and utilizing neutralizing routines so that we can ensure that we are checking our own unconscious biases and that we're really responding consistently and creating equitable learning environments and response systems for students in our schools.
Right, so important. You know, I often think about myself when I was a classroom teacher and how when I'm in the middle of a moment, a challenging moment with a student, it can be really hard to try to figure out, okay, how do I respond? What do I do? What's the protocol? And that's not the best time to be making those types of decisions. So we want to really think about how do we ensure consistency?
Great. Thanks, Karen. You're absolutely right. Behavior errors are going to happen. And the more that we can clarify staff responses to those errors, the more predictable environment we can create. And that's going to lead to better student outcomes.
Yeah. One concern that teams often share is that, you know, we have different students who all need different consequences because they have different needs, and there's a concern that a flow chart will mean that we have to respond to every situation the same way for every student.
Yeah, so so that's not exactly right, right? We want to have consistent protocols for addressing and responding to the concerning behavior, and we really do want to come to consensus with staff about how to respond and, around those behavior definitions as we discussed in part one. But we also want to recognize that we need to have some flexibility based on the needs and abilities of individual students. And so we're certainly not saying that we want, a zero tolerance policy, implemented or things like that, that we want to implement a consistent and fair system in our schools that's going to work for all staff and students.
Yeah, right. So important.
The flowchart helps keep the element of surprise away, right? And so once we create this referral process, that we want to really make sure that we're sharing it with students and families so that promotes transparency and trust. So a lot of schools will incorporate this into their student or family handbook, for example, or include it on their website.
Yeah, and it can be really hard to try to understand or envision what a behavior response flowchart looks like. So let's take a look at a few examples.
Great idea.
Here's one that I think is great because it embeds proactive practices for staff to be doing as well. If you look here, right at the start, it tells you what are the things that as staff members that we should be doing to try to prevent problematic or concerning behavior from ever even happening.
I love that.
What's that?
I said, I love that.
Yeah, it's a really good, I love this example. So, but then behavior errors will happen, right? So helping staff to understand that the first thing we need to do is refer to our behavior definitions and think about whether the behavior we're experiencing is major or minor. And then what are the things that we can do in class? And if it doesn't improve, right, then we move into creating a minor referral. And I know a lot of staff really appreciate being able to say that it's only after 3 episodes of interrupting or disruptive behavior, then we classify that as a minor, rather than a student who's calling out every once in a while is not something that needs to be documented the same way as when it's something that's more ongoing. But if it's a more major behavior, if it's an episode of physical aggression or harassment or bullying or some of those other definitions that you've already decided on, well, so now we know how we respond to that and what the expectation is as a staff member as well, and what the student will be experiencing. And the other strength of this example is that it really shows not just the difference between a major and a minor, but what if even after you've intervened, you're still having some challenges, and it's all right here in a really clear way to follow. And then I have just love this conversations for success. So what are the things that, again, I'm thinking, Heidi, when you were talking about the vulnerable decision points, right? What are some sentence starters? What are some questions that I can just have at the ready rather than trying to figure it out in the moment?
Yeah, I love that. I love the conversations for success, Karen. And every school does this a little bit differently. So let's look at a few other examples.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, so so this one with the stars, I like how it outlines low-level responses for staff for addressing the concerning behavior and identifies the specific steps for providing error correction. This can serve as a great prompt and reminder to staff, right, after they've been taught how to do this. This form also outlines when to start using a minor referral form, which is something that a lot of our schools really struggle with, whether or not to track minors, and what if you have those minor behaviors that are persistent and ongoing, right? How do you handle that? So I like how this form really outlines that. And then this high school behavior flow chart outlines specific behaviors that that would be staff or handled by administration. And it also outlines the responsibilities and strategies that staff and administration will use. And so, and it communicates to staff that administrators will follow up after an office discipline referral has been made, both with the student and caregiver, but also with the referring adult. And that's one of the common concerns that we hear, right, is that teachers often feel like they have taken the time to complete those referral forms, but they don't hear about follow-up, and can get frustrated by that.
Yeah, that's a really common concern. And I think, and I love how you stressed at the start here how important it is that we don't just hand this document off to staff, right? We have to teach staff, and not only that, but encourage staff to be a part of the process of creating a document like this.
Absolutely, and getting feedback from our stakeholders, right? Which leads us to our next step. So we really want to start thinking about how you'll develop this flowchart with your teams and solicit feedback from stakeholders and action plan. And so we want to make sure that we're documenting any steps that you identify in your action plan. And if you want to find this particular activity, you'll find that in your Getting Started workbook, which is section 2B, step number 7. So make sure that you check out parts 1 and 3 of this series as well. And if you have any additional questions or would like additional support, please reach out to your Massachusetts Academy trainers. Thank you so much for watching and for engaging in this important work. It's so important.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.